Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Brian Gemmell. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for National Grid's New York electric business. And I've been talking I'm one of the board members at Wires. I know there's a lot about policy, but I've been also talking about some of the challenges that I'm seeing across the industry. And really the genesis was my harping on to Larry about supply chain and other challenges of making transmission viable, and from not just my transmission portfolio, but my distribution, and making sure I've got the right products at the right time to serve our customers. And for the other utility members in the audience and the associate members from their technologies and solutions, we've all experienced over these past years a change in cost and schedule for basic services. Things have gone from weeks to months, months to years, years to multiple years. So it's an honor for me to moderate this panel today, and I look forward to an engaging discussion. We welcome Hailey Siple, who is the Director of National Security Policy at the Edison Electric Institute. Welcome, Hailey. We have Arthur Haubenstock, who's the Chief Strategy Advisor to the Office of Manufacturing and Energy Supply Chain at the U.S. Department of Energy. And Tony Zito, who's the Director of Sales Operations at Siemens Energy. And full disclosure, Tony and I used to work together, so we go back a long ways. So we wanted to jump in, and I wanted to start with you, Arthur, if I may. Arthur, could you talk about the role that the Department of Energy, and particularly your Office for Manufacturing and Energy Supply Chains, is really playing to help ensure those supply chains are not a constraint on the deployment, and also helping build domestic supply chain capacity? Particularly to introduce perhaps the role first to the audience.
Absolutely. So thank you all for the opportunity. It's great to be back at Wires. I think it's been a little over a decade since I last spoke at a Wires conference, and it's both exciting and depressing to hear many of the same topics being talked about. But I will say that there is a renewed absolute urgency on these issues, and a recognition, I think, for the first time in a really long time, that this is absolutely critical to our economy, not just to making progress on the clean energy transition, but also just to keep the lights on and keep our economy moving, and to make sure that we have the national security that we need relative to other countries. So we're really excited to be contributing to that with the Office of Manufacturing and Energy Supply Chains, commonly known as MESC for anybody who's ever heard of us. But we're one of the offices that has been created as a result of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. By the end of this year, we will have programmed about $20 billion in clean energy infrastructure, most of that in manufacturing and in materials processing, but also in skilled workforce training. I will note that when we talk to CEOs, and we talk to a lot of CEOs, if workforce isn't the first thing that they mention, it is absolutely the second or third, and that's very common across all of our offices. A good chunk of what we are programming is in transmission, because it is the lifeblood of our energy system and will increasingly be so as we work on industrial decarbonization, which is another area that our office is responsible for. But as we look towards adaptation to all of the strains that are being placed on our system, whether it is load demand increased or whether it is climate change. And so we're really pleased about the $250 million that I can talk about. So one of the things we do is that we process the applications for the 48C tax credit, which is for advanced manufacturing. We can only talk about those credits that the taxpayer decides they want us to talk about, because it's taxpayer private information and I don't want to go to jail, thank you very much. But there were some very significant tax credits that were provided that we can talk about. I want to say thank you to Siemens for giving us that latitude, and we're excited about what they are doing to really make sure that we have what we need when we need it to not just build out the transmission needs, but also to respond to things like the hurricanes that we have seen recently. We also have a program called 40209, which is focused on advanced energy manufacturing and recycling for energy communities. I want to thank Senator Manchin in particular for his focus on that. So that's for census tracts and the adjacent census tracts where there were coal operations, whether coal generation or coal mining, and we announced some very interesting grid enhancing technology related investments that we are making. And we're very similar, for those of you who are familiar, we're similar to the Loan Programs Office. The Loan Programs Office is on the debt side. The Manufacturing Energy Supply Chain Office is on the equity side. You can think of it that way. But maybe even more important than the $20 billion that we are programming is our analytical role. And we're very, very excited to be rolling out what we're calling the Supply Chain Readiness Level Framework. We've just completed our first chapter of that on batteries, both for EVs and for grid. Grid is coming very soon thereafter, and we'll have something public to talk about in the coming months, so we're very excited about that. And it is looking all the way from raw materials through processed materials, through engineered components, to actual manufactured products, to ensure that globally there is sufficient supply to meet demand, and in terms of security, that the United States has access either through domestic manufacturing or through friend-shored or near-shored applications to meet that demand. There are some real significant gaps, and those gaps are helping direct federal funding as well as private sector funding, because what we're all about in the Department of Energy with this new third that we call the Undersecretary of Infrastructure Office is government-enabled but private sector-led investment. Ultimately, as the billions and billions of dollars we're investing are a drop in the bucket. It's a great down payment. It's an important down payment. We're making a big difference in moving the needle, but the journey really has to be from all of you, the private sector, who are going to take that de-risking that we're trying to do and make the investments that we need. Long introduction, I apologize. Thank you all for the time.
Thank you, Arthur. Hailey, you're with the EEI. Can you talk about the proactivity in support of these future markets the EEI is undertaking for the different technologies and manufacturing capacity, both here domestically as well as internationally as well?
Absolutely. So my role at EEI, I help lead our national security team. And that's really fun because it is an all hazards role, and I get to have my hands in sort of everything we're doing, a little bit of natural disasters, a little bit of cybersecurity, like anything that can go wrong, I get to look at it and play with it.
That's a fun job.
It's a fun job, yeah. So I have a bit of an overarching view of the things that EEI is doing. And there are a couple of different paths that EEI is taking to address this issue. We're best known as an advocacy and policy organization, and we are certainly doing a lot of advocacy, but we also play a really significant non-advocacy convener role for our members. We help them get together and share their experiences and identify concerns that really span the industry. We have a couple of really hands-on operational, technical, in the weeds working groups. We have one dedicated to transmission that looks at some of the very transmission-specific issues, and of course we have one for distribution as well, metering, several different lines of engagement there. And we have a really strong group of chief procurement officers. So this came about just a couple of years ago, during COVID, actually, sort of the first year or so after COVID. Those first weeks of COVID were the busiest weeks of my career ever. We were working 16-hour days, coming up with something we called the COVID Resource Guide. And this was a document that started out like a 6-page pamphlet with some leading practices and recommendations. And over that span of time, a couple of weeks, it ended up being a 160-page document that was translated into different languages and used for different sectors. And while we were doing that, that is the first time that I remember really sitting down and thinking about supply chain, the energy supply chain in particular, as a national security threat. And I think the conversation changed very much at that point. So we had really no immediate impacts those first couple weeks or months, but a few months down the road, we had first one of our chief procurement officers come and say, hey, we're seeing some long lead times, we're seeing some shortages. Is it just us? And then we had another CPO come and say, we're seeing these challenges, is it just us? And by the third or fourth CPO, we realized we need these people to talk to each other. They are all saying the same thing, and this is clearly an industry-wide challenge. So we started this group of chief procurement officers to address these kinds of issues in particular. And that has been such a fun and just fascinating convening forum. So it's largely availability based. We have other folks who are working on supply chain security challenges, but we're also seeing those converge a lot more than I think any of us expected to.
So there's one chief procurement for transmission under EI?
There is, so not particularly. So we have 60-something member companies, and each one of those have sent us their chief procurement officer.
Got it.
And they love to talk to each other. They've never had the opportunity to talk to each other like this. So that's one of the things I'm really proud of standing up in the past few years. We also have less on the proactive front, but to help respond to incidents. We have several really effective equipment sharing programs in the industry. And while that doesn't add quantitatively to the industry's critical equipment supply, it does enable the industry to leverage all of our available resources and make the best use of the supplies that we have. So those are really essential programs for things like hurricane response, like Arthur mentioned. Particularly Helene and Milton, we saw a lot of requests for very specific pieces of equipment that folks could not get a large supply of in time. And there's so many mechanisms within the industry, several that EEI leads, but several that function within the regional mutual assistance groups as well, that just enable folks to get together and share freely. There's a program that's dedicated to large power transformers. There's a program that's dedicated to smaller transmission materials, and we're working some distribution materials in there now. It's really a fascinating way to make the best use of those supplies. I want to highlight one other partnership, though, and this is my very favorite project to highlight in terms of proactive supply chain engagement. There is a fantastic relationship between industry, and not just EEI, but all segments of the industry, and the Department of Energy through the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, the ESCC. For folks who aren't familiar with this group, this is the primary liaison between industry and the federal government on national security issues. And it's a group of about 30 industry CEOs. It's all CEO led. And I get to help run this group, which is really, really a blessing. But these folks come together to solve national security problems, specifically when they require an all of industry or an industry government response. Supply chain definitely falls into that bucket. And about the same time period that we saw our chief procurement officers want to talk, we spun up an ESCC supply chain tiger team. So this was a few years ago. This was well before we had Arthur and his team to really dive into these issues on our behalf. But we met with federal partners at DOE and with manufacturers every Friday afternoon for 18 months, where we started like really from the ground hashing out what the moving pieces of this really complex supply chain problem are. It was a lot of hours of talking to each other, but it was time that was really well spent, because that is where many of the ideas and initiatives to strengthen domestic manufacturing and streamline equipment production and address barriers to domestic critical mineral mining, all of these ideas sort of were born through those conversations. And now we're just absolutely lucky to have an entire department that's dedicated to helping us solve those issues.
Thank you, Hailey. So we've heard from the DOE, EI, Tony, representing all of manufacturing for the
No
world.
pressure.
No pressure. Big shoulders. What are some of the demand drivers you're seeing that are current, and what are the factors that could impact that demand up or down? And what are some of the challenges for you as a manufacturing global company in really embarking in new production capabilities, whether it be in the United States or any other markets serving that global demand?
Sure. So first of all, I have been in the electric equipment industry for 35 years, or as ChatGPT suggested I consider it, I'm a seasoned professional. And in various roles, from engineering all the way up through sales, direct with customers. I had a small role in IT for a while, and then now for the last 26 years in either directly selling to customers or managing the sale and the interaction with the industry customers. So when you talk about the drivers right now, there's two perspectives here. As someone who has been in this industry for a while, I have obviously lived through many ups and downs. And in this industry, the peaks tend to be very high, but very brief. And the valleys, or the troughs, tend to be very low and very long. And so I've lived through, as a manufacturer, the closing of multiple plants. And when those plants close, you lose long-term friendships, relationships with everyone from winders in transformers up to plant managers who are now, some of them find roles. But when 500, 600 people suddenly are jobless, they leave the industry because it's at a time where nobody's hiring. And so it's a little painful, both from a stranded capital standpoint. You invest $200-300 million for this peak, and in 2-3 years it's gone, and now you've got this money spent, and you have now the cost to shut down the plant, which is very, very expensive. But more importantly, the human cost. I mean, you have families that have relocated, families that have left jobs to come to this job, and suddenly they're unemployed in an industry that's not hiring. So there's a lot of cost, and so there's a lot of hesitancy as a manufacturer. But at the same time, when you look at the drivers right now, I sat with the president of a major IOU probably 5-6 months ago, and he went through the 4 drivers of what was driving his demands right now. And they gave us their 10-year plan, and their 10-year plan just showed continued growth of demand. And all of the drivers, I won't get into too many specifics, but not one of the drivers was tied to the economy. None of the drivers was tied to whether the economy goes down or the economy goes up. So no matter what happens to the economy, recession, depression, those drivers, the demand was not going to go away. It actually, and I asked him that when he got done listing them, he didn't make that comment. I said, it's very interesting. You've listed these 4 drivers, and all of them are basically tied to government mandate in one way or the other, whether it be climate, whether energy transition, bringing in renewables, all of those things. And so what was interesting was, I said, so the economy has no impact. He said, yeah. And I said, realistically, if you think about it, what does government do if we do have a downturn? Stimulus. So the worst thing to the industry might be a downturn, because there might be even more demand created due to government. And that's not a bad thing, but it's an interesting scale. There's some cautiousness on our end. And I'm speaking personally, I haven't got approval to say that, but there's obviously cautiousness to some standpoint, and yet there's all these projections of demand that's almost infinite in terms of time. But the drivers are, they're data centers and AI, which is, 4 years ago, nobody was talking AI from a power standpoint. And now when you go into any of the big players, whether it be an Amazon or a Google, et cetera, I can't talk specifics, but when you go in and talk to them, they're not talking gigabytes or terabytes, they're talking gigawatts and terawatts of demand. They see their business as a consumer of power and very focused on that. And that's where their biggest constraint is getting power and getting equipment to provide power. So that's number one. There's the energy transition. You've got New York and California where they're banning new gas. And so, you decide to redevelop a building, and maybe half of the power consumption is gas related for ovens hot water heaters and half electric, everything has to be electric now. So it isn't really an energy demand growth, but you're increasing the electricity demand growth because you're shifting that gas-powered demand to electricity. So that's another one. You've got all the bringing in the renewables, whether it be onshore or all this offshore wind that's coming in, and then all of the grid needs associated with that. Even if you don't have any load growth, you're now moving where the supply is coming from, the generation sources are changing, and now you have all the grid enhancements needed, transmission lines, substations, phase shifters, reactors, all of the equipment needs and all the breakers and associated equipment to get that power to move it from new locations to the existing demand, and also the new demand from all these data centers that are growing everywhere.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. If I look at the forward demand curve and scenarios that even have for my utility, I've got gigawatt of variability on the 2050 view with customer adoptions of all of the technologies and load centers. Arthur, to you, given that context of we're all looking at it's not just the United States, but if we're local here, it's a multi-decade view. What could the DOE and other arms of the government do that would be beneficial, including the ways of addressing the relative disadvantages of the US market and making those long-term commitments to manufacturing and supply chain?
That's a great question, and I actually would love the audiences and my co-panelists' perspectives on that. We like to say we're from the government, we're here to help. We have lots of ideas. Ultimately, the funds that we can make available are according to whatever Congress appropriates at the end of the day. But it's really fascinating. We talk, again, to CEOs of manufacturing facilities from across the energy spectrum and increasingly on the transmission and distribution side. And although we're making a lot of resources available, what's been fascinating to me is that a number of these key participants have said that they're not really in desperate need for further tax credits. They're not in desperate need for further grants. They're in desperate need of certainty. It's what Tony was talking about, is that it's really very moving when you think about it, that CEOs are really very concerned about bringing in a whole host of skilled workers only to find that the manufacturing facility that they have stood up and getting the skilled workers to get there is really probably the biggest hurdle. Energy to run the manufacturing facility, maybe number two. But they don't want to make that investment only to find that there isn't an off-taker at the end of the day. It's really, for those of you who are energy market heads, and I've spent probably way too much of my life on these things, it is remarkably similar to the problem that we have in the United States with long-term capacity requirements on the energy side. We know that there is going to be tremendous demand. We don't know who's going to actually be picking that up. And to Tony's point, I don't know that I would agree that it's a government mandate. AI, maybe not so much. There are huge economic drivers, regardless of what may happen in the next couple of weeks. Those drivers are not going away. The climate change issues are not going away. The need for increased reliability is not going away. The need for AI and to digitize our economy is not going away. And our need to compete globally is not going away. And to your point, when we talk to a lot of these global manufacturers, they say, we have a choice about where we're going to invest. We would love to invest in the United States. The market is huge and it is growing. But when we have those choices, we can go to a sovereign utility that has no problem making a 10, 15, 20-year commitment for offtake. Where is that in the United States? When we talk to the utilities, they say, well, our Public Utilities Commission is not allowing us to make those kinds of long-term commitments. When we talk to independent and merchant developers, they say, we know there's a need out there and we can put some money down for some of this manufacturing, and some of them have. It's been an interesting model, but they're not really able to put on their balance sheets the kinds of commitments that you need for that long-term offtake. So, and Rob Gramlich will weigh in on this. Long-term forward capacity markets have had their ups and downs, but are there models out there where the US government can in some ways act like other sovereigns and create that risk reduction mechanism without putting a too heavy hand on the market. I think one interesting model that has worked, it's starting to work at least, on the merchant and independent transmission side is the Transmission Facilitation Program. And the Transmission Facilitation Program is run by our sister office, the Grid Deployment Office. And what it does is it allows GDO, Grid Deployment Office, to act like an anchor tenant for transmission. And to say, we'll go in and guarantee that your transmission capacity will be taken up. And that way you can go out there and get the financing you need, you can get the permitting, you can build your transmission project. By the time you're getting close to commercial online, we'll sell our position. With that, we do have to be careful about these things. Ultimately, the Treasury holds the bill, and if that capacity doesn't show up, the Treasury would have to pay for it. But the notion is that the government would then step out and allow the market to pick up that capacity. At least theoretically, that's something that could be done on the manufacturing side. But again, that would probably take new authorities and new appropriations. Appropriations only in the insurance sense. The Transmission Facilitation Program doesn't actually have money flow out the door. It relies on the full faith and credit of the United States, so it doesn't actually have to create a transaction other than a paper transaction. But the Treasury does reserve those funds in the event that that capacity doesn't show up when transmission goes online.
With the work you've done, Hailey, with the chief procurement officers, with your members, is there consensus alignment of perhaps more the government could play, following on the same question here, with this future of the view?
I think so. I think this is something that is going to require industry and government to really come together and be creative. I want to foot stomp two things that were just set up here, and one is that these drivers are not going away, and the other is that they are not tied to the rest of the economy, which is fascinating. It's really fascinating. And so I think one thing that we need to recognize is that the primary limiting factor on how fast AI can grow and evolve is always going to be how fast we can provide power to them. And we know that it's really essential, especially from a national security perspective, that we do help them to grow and advance. I know many of us have our reservations about AI. It creeps me out a little bit, but it's going to be a huge part of our lives moving forward. And I really hate this phrasing, but I think winning the war on AI against China and other adversaries to a lesser extent is going to be a huge part of our national security strategy as we look ahead. So it's a really interesting balance where our ability to build and operate grid infrastructure will always play the role of that limiting factor. And this isn't something that we've done wrong or something that we can fix. It's just the fact that AI can scale so much more quickly and doesn't require the same long supply chain, the same long build times that physical infrastructure is going to require. And I am confident that growth is always going to outpace the gains we make in energy efficiency as well. So even if we start trying to cut back, I don't think we're gonna meet the need that way. And I don't mean for this to be negative, and Anthony said something very similar. I don't mean for this to mean that we're not ever gonna meet demand, but rather that people will use as much electricity as we give them going forward. I know, given how electrons work, that's tautological, but you get the point. And I think there's going to be some other really interesting factors as well to watch that are not just how much electricity we're using, but where that demand is going to be in the future. I think we're going to see some sort of migration shifts domestically. There is some fantastic work coming out of NREL right now that is sort of mapping and predicting domestic migration patterns due to things like climate change that are making once really desirable areas basically uninhabitable for human people. So we're seeing where people are shift, and we can expect to see more of that in the future. And that's something we're going to have to learn to build for and predict and meet sort of a changing face of demand, as well as the changing growth of demand.
Yeah, in my backyard, I've had 7 major storms that weren't as bad as the ones that we experienced in the southeast more recently, or the wildfires out west. But from a customer interruption perspective, of the 7, 5 of them are my worst 20 storms. I've had them this year, but that's for the past 20 years. Mm-hmm. You know, so the climate is having an impact, especially as we go electrification.
Mm-hmm. And maybe it makes you want to move somewhere else.
Yeah.
Some people are facing that decision, and it's really interesting.
And it's also where their job, you know, it's where their jobs are available. Mm-hmm. Tony, I turn to you. That, you know, I read with music that used to work for Siemens. You know, I've seen about these contracts that are being negotiated elsewhere in the world for frame deals for undefined projects, especially in some of these higher technology, HVDC, the like. Could you talk about, from your perspective, what are the strategies and innovations that you see the progressive transmission owners and equipment customers are really adopting, either here and, you know, giving an example? You've talked to this CEO you spoke to recently. You know, give us a sense of what good looks like. What are the best of the transmission owners doing to address the challenges we're talking about?
Sure. So you really see 2 different strategies out there at a time like this, where there's such a mismatch in the supply and demand. One strategy is to expand your footprint of suppliers you'll accept. So have more suppliers available, hopefully giving you access to more capacity. The pros of that is you have access to more capacity in terms of suppliers. The negatives, you don't have any real deep relationship with any 1 or 2 or 3 suppliers, and that's going to make, as a supplier, kind of when you're talking about having long-term goals, I'm much more inclined to deal with a customer that I have a long-term relationship in this market and can give me some kind of, not necessarily guaranteed demand, but fairly secure demand, comfort in their demand for the next 5 to 10 years. And so that's one strategy. The other strategy, and as a supplier I prefer, is looking to partner with a select few suppliers and strengthen that relationship. So we have many suppliers. The one I spoke about, it would be one of them, where in the past, they, you know, our alliance partners would give us 2 years predicted of what they needed, and we were kind of we had capacity allotted for them for the next 2 years. Now we're talking 10-year plans. It's beyond 5, where we now are getting their 5-year plan. Now, as you said, they don't know the project in 5 years, but they're anticipating they need demand. They're going to need to provide substations, transmission, et cetera. They don't know exactly where. They don't know where the data center is going to be built in 2034, but they know there will be one. And so they're reserving capacity now. On the long term, it's more of a handshake agreement, but as a partner. And then as we get closer, you know, it gets more firm. And for customers that aren't necessarily long-term partners, but some of the, as an example, the offshore wind companies, which are all new, so you don't have a long-term relationship, but they're looking to establish relationships to secure capacity. We're doing, and our competitors are doing the same thing. We're doing slot reservations, where they're paying up front for capacity, but they may not have the details of what the ratings of the unit are, or even what project it will be used on. Maybe it's this offshore wind project, maybe it's another one, maybe it's globally. These are all global players. They may take that capacity that was for a US offshore wind that gets canceled or delayed, and they want to use it on a project in the North Sea. So, but that seems to be where everyone's gravitating right now, especially in the projects that are a little less certain, at least in terms of timing. You know, the offshore wind have seen lots of delays, some cancellations that just become rebids, but they're really a delay. But they need to know today that they have capacity for equipment for a project that they want to build in 3 years, but they're not going to green light till 2 years from today. So you can't, with lead times at 3 to 6 years, you can't do that. So you need to secure capacity now. So they're reserving capacity through slot reservation agreements and those sort of mechanisms.
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Sure.
Because it's been really eye-opening for me. I've heard a number of perspectives on how many of those slot reservations are being taken up not by utilities, but by data centers and other C&I customers. And that's a dynamic that I'd never heard before 10 years ago when I was speaking at Wires last time.
So without getting too specific, as an example, we had one data center customer that, let's say 4 years ago, we were the sole supplier to them globally. We now, let's say, can't serve more than 20% of what they say their need is for the next couple of years. The demand has escalated. Several of the data center customers have approached us, and I'm sure they've approached our competitors and saying, what would it take to buy all of your capacity for the next 5 years or the next 10 years? As you mentioned, we've announced a new factory making transformers in Charlotte, which thank you very much for the incentive.
Thank you for doing the work.
My pleasure, our pleasure, not my pleasure, our pleasure. But we had more than one customer, both utility and data center, who approached and said, what would it take to buy all of that output for 5 years? Now, as a manufacturer, because of the uncertainty I already talked about, I don't want to dedicate all my capacity to a customer that isn't a government that, really long term, when they make a commitment, it's going to be there. That's a danger. You have all your eggs in one basket. What happens if they go bankrupt or they decide they're not building anymore, and now you've alienated every other customer, every other utility, data center customer, renewable customer. So we look at sort of a mitigation strategy to spread the love around, right? To not everyone. Again, it's the same strategy of, do you go to everyone or do you get a handful? We've tried to pick a handful of customers from each of the segments of the industry. So some utility customers, some renewable customers, some generation, there's fossil, nuclear now, some of the generation, some of the data centers, some of the industrial customers, and try to make sure we're supplying to all of them, both for the short term in comfort level risk, but also in the long term. Because what you don't want to do is say, I don't want to sell to you, and then 3 years from now, when the bottom falls out, go back and beg someone for their business. That customer is either going to say, get out of here, or you're not going to have very favorable terms. So it really is a risk, just like there's a risk mitigation as a customer, it's a risk mitigation as a supplier to try to balance it out. But you're right, the data center demand is such that the industry as a whole can't deliver right now, whether it be transformers, breakers, et cetera. It's a problem globally, but specifically domestically, very much so, a case of a very big imbalance of supply and demand.
Could you just talk with what you can share about that decision time frame of that new plant coming to the United States, and then when are you anticipating rolling units out? For an awareness of what it's going to take from a supplier to invest in brand new manufacturing.
So, talking generalities again, we've announced that capacity should be exiting the factory end of 2026, with groundbreaking having occurred in 2024. So it's about 24 months to you're, let's say, at scale. But when you talk about in general, we looked at several options, and I'm not the top guy, right? But I was involved somewhat in the decision making, or at least in the discussions. If you're going to go greenfield, starting from scratch, you're looking at 3 to 4 years from, let's build a plant, to getting production at scale. And part of that is you need to find a site. You got to negotiate buying the site. You need to get permitting for utilities and roads and infrastructure, rail line, all of that, very complicated. You're looking at 3 to 4 years. That made no sense. The need is now, and for us, and the last thing you want to do is build a plant and then You build it and they don't come. There's no demand. Then you could go brownfield. Brownfield, you have infrastructure already, right? There's a rail line, theoretically. You've got power. You've got things you need. It's a plant that used to make refrigerators that doesn't anymore, and it works. You need to modify it, but you've got a starting point. You're still looking at 2.5 to 3 years with a brownfield site that you're just going to go buy someone's site, because you got to negotiate all those things. And then what we did, what was best, was a brownfield site that we owned. So we narrowed it down. We looked at the timing. If we could take an existing Siemens Energy facility, and we looked at 3 or 4 that we already had domestically that either had capacity that they didn't need to use anymore, or we had stopped manufacturing, whatever. We had excess room to build and some excess existing infrastructure. That was more of an 18 to 24 months, because the day you say go, you already own it. You can start running wire and digging up the ground, et cetera. So that was the thinking on our end, and why we chose to build, one of the reasons we chose to build at a site that was existing for Siemens Energy, a facility we had in Charlotte.
Can I jump in right quick? So you asked earlier where DOE could step in and support utilities a little bit. And I think this uncertainty is a really important thing to point to, where I think there are some government levers that could be pulled. They're challenging ones, but I think there's some interesting solutions. So we don't know where these are going to be needed. We don't know when. We don't know by whom they're going to be needed, but we do know they are going to be needed. And we know that, keeping up with the demand growth is both a national security concern, a concern for our economic competitiveness. It's really important to the survival of the United States. And so we see value in something like government performing a backstop role, where this is a critical asset that is absolutely essential for defense, really, really essential for the country to have. And we think something like a stockpile of excess transformers, whatever it is that we're producing, would serve the industry really well. And that doesn't mean a stockpile where government puts in a bunch of orders right now, because we know that that's not realistic. But if government could play a role of agreeing to take on those unsold units and provide that certainty to investors, to manufacturers, those are going to be needed at some time. So that's something we are thinking a lot about. It's a complex solution, but it's one with a lot of potential.
So let me just, please.
Real quick, I mean, I've thought about it myself, and one way you could think about it would be maybe much like the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which is used, right? In the same way it's energy, but a different part. The difference is oil is fungible, right? It's standard, it's oil. And the problem we face is, and everyone here would know this that's in the industry, is there's no standardization. Yeah. You're not even as simple as some is 345, or is it 500, or is it 138, but your 345 is not the same as your 362, as your 330 kV. There's so much variation in the voltage levels. Forget about MVA, because you could run a unit lower. But the voltage levels, impedance, et cetera, there are real hurdles. And EEI knows this very well. That standardization would help. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No. That's you took the words right out of my mouth. So this is a great conversation. I really appreciate it. That is one of the concrete things that we are already doing at the Department of Energy. So the Office of Electricity, the OG of all these issues, has been doing 3 things on standardization. One is it created a taxonomy across transmission and distribution elements, so that everybody's talking the same language, at least.
That helps.
Then it created an encyclopedia of interoperability, so that you could determine what equipment could be used across this diaspora of different specs that exists across the grid. But it also started to look at how far can you go in manufacturing with a generic skid. and then specialize from there. And we're doing the same thing on HVDC as well. And you can get to 60, 70%, generally speaking, depending on whether you're talking about a distribution transformer or a large power transformer or HVDC, but you can get to a generic level. So it's at least theoretically possible that government could help get manufacturers to that point before a piece of kit needs to get specialized for a particular application. And that could be available for emergency response, like hurricanes and so on.
I'll put in one more quick plug, because all of that standardization work that Arthur is talking about came directly from the ESCC. So that's sort of the space we were collaborating with DOE to come up with creative solutions.
I met with one of our distribution transformer suppliers recently, and he quoted that last year they had 25,000 different designs of distribution transformer flow through their factory. 25,000.
Yeah.
So I've got one last question, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. So putting everyone on deck to ask the panel questions. But it was the last one for you, Hailey. Okay. We've talked about supply chain, and are we in? As we're evolving, but we've got lead times. I in my world think, are we in a new norm for lead times? Are we going to see lead times go back to pre-pandemic levels, or is this the new norm?
So I don't necessarily think that this is a new norm, but I do think the way that we plan and scale transmission is never going to be the same as it was pre-COVID. And this is not really anything about COVID or about supply chain, it's about the demand growth that we've talked about and the migration that we've talked about. I think geopolitics is going to play a huge role here as well, because now, after decades of really sort of vulnerably relying on critical supplies to just appear from overseas, we're starting to have these good conversations about reviving U.S. manufacturing capacity. We're seeing it happen on this stage in real time. And if we truly commit to weaning off of foreign or even just adversarial suppliers, I think we could see a very extended time of long lead times that probably doesn't improve linearly. It probably moves around quite a bit because it's subject to political whims and workforce attitudes and other economic events, and of course to geopolitical tensions or periods of peace that could really speed it up or really derail it at any time.
Okay.
I think uncertainty is the new norm.
Okay.
Yeah, if I could just real quickly build on that. We're seeing a manufacturing renaissance happen now. Some 900 new manufacturing facilities across different sectors have been announced or commenced across the country as a result of this new influx of stimulus that we've seen over the last 2 years. They need power. Now, we're doing a very tight look at where the power is coming from and ensuring that that is de-risked, because we need that manufacturing, especially on the energy supply chain side, to keep the lights on. So there's a lot for you folks to do. I'm really glad you're here in the room and doing all this hard work, and whatever we can do to be of support, that's what we love to do.
Great. We've got time for a few questions from the audience. Drew has the microphone, and it is bright on stage.
Is this on? Oh, perfect. Hi. Thank you again for your time today. My name is Alexis. I cover energy regulation for Bloomberg Law. I love that you all mentioned, these slot reservation agreements, especially in light of recent deals Microsoft, Google, Amazon have been making. But I'm just curious to get your thoughts on, how these agreements can be regulated to ensure that, reliability and affordability is secured for not only just ratepayers as a whole, but really the communities that get impacted by, data centers and things of that sort.
So let me start off by saying that I'm a lawyer by training, but I am not a lawyer for the Department of Energy. And so my speaking as to new regulations on manufacturing slots, probably a little over my skis. I mean, I guess the question is, I would ask back to you is regulation really the right response? You know, how do we ensure that we have what we need? So not only are we doing our supply chain readiness levels for the grid, and we're looking to head to 2030, 2050 to see across the whole range what is actually needed to supply expected demand. Where is it going to come from and how secure is that? In addition, we're working across the Department of Energy. The Grid Deployment Office is working with NREL on identifying what is needed to meet the needs that they've identified in their transmission needs study, for example. So we're creating that spotlight for the private sector to come in and say, this is where the growth is, this is where the puck is going to be, this is where we need to skate to. You're asking a great question. I mean, I think it's resource adequacy is talked about in a pretty broad way. I don't know that resource adequacy has ever stepped all the way back to manufacturing. You know, we're having a hard enough time with this, with making sure there's enough generation online. But it is a really important planning question, and there is real concern that we will be short. And so lots of great conversations to have about how do we make sure that we fill that need.
If I could just add to that, as a manufacturer, even when we're doing slot reservations, it's still in a competitive situation. I mean, there's the customers going out to multiple suppliers. We're all offering what our lead time is, but also what would we require to hold that lead time, a slot. And it's a competitive thing. We're giving a price for the slot, someone else is. And at the time you're giving the slot price, you're quoting, you go back a step, they're asking for a quote on the unit. So you've already become the choice based on your lead time of that slot and your proposed price in advance. So it's already in an open competitive, and if you're a capitalist, a fair market that has hopefully got to the best value. It may not be the lowest price, but it's a combination of price, lead time, technical details, as every procurement situation is.
Let me add one more thought. I do want to say that public utilities commissions are starting to ask supply chain questions. They had real shortages in deploying storage that they were expecting to be online to keep the lights on. And so they're asking those questions, and so they're asking the utilities, how do you know that what you have contracted for is actually going to come online? Asking those questions will help ensure that we have what we need.
And I'll just add really quickly, I think I love that question. It's a huge consideration. But I think some of that could balance out in the longer term as we sort of adapt to the new environment and start incorporating more of those folks and their plans into our transmission planning processes. So some of that could happen a little more organically, I think.
We have time for one more.
We're going to 11:15, so we have time
Oh,
for a
you are
couple
11:15?
more. Yeah.
Oh, time. Oh, okay, because I thought it was 11.
Okay, never mind. All right.
Is there one more then?
Well, then maybe.
Hearing none. Hailey, Arthur, Tony, on behalf of Wires, thank you for joining us at our fall meeting. We really appreciate your expertise and candid comments. It's really been fun for me to moderate and get to know you all, and it's a really big topic. Arthur, we hope you're going to be back before 10 years from now.
Invite me.
We will gladly have you back, and really appreciate your comments. So if I could ask everyone to show your appreciation for our really excellent panel this morning. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
All right, well,